cheering. Thank you, thank you. So I thought we were going to start. First, the end of this week, we will post questions that will be for the final exam. We've been huffing and trying to think of very interesting questions or ways we could work the next few classes around them to help. I was at the World Bank Monday, so I'm happy to be talking about a little bit of this issue, and I'll tell you some things that they had to say. I want to just do three things. Just first is the spread of this recession. We mostly stressed the U.S., but the general consensus is what the US and the UK did caused problems every place. I actually think that's probably exaggerated because the Europeans, we didn't cause the problems in Spain, and the Europeans were also in a housing bubble, and nobody's yet said we caused the housing bubble in Japan, which occurred 15 years earlier. So it's just we happen to be the ones who caused this one, and we're big, and we'll see that. So this is just a quote from Justin Lin. He must be, he is the first Chinese economist from China who is the chief economist at the World Bank. And he just says, this has impacted the whole world. And the key thing is these conditions in the years to come, more difficult international conditions in years to come. This is going to cost the world huge sums of money for a long period. So this is just showing that the big driver of the decline this is industrial production, so that's sort of manufacturing, is the advanced countries. That's one of the messages is this has been driven by us, of course. This is the same thing. This is the global GDP rate. You see the world rate is in between the advanced countries and the emerging and developing economies. So we and the Europeans and the Brits drove the thing down. We dragged, and we'll give you some estimates in a minute, some dragging coefficients more or less. We dragged the rest of the guys down with us. And then there's been the recovery of sorts that we're in now. And of course they project future reasonable rates of growth. They could be a second hit, so on, we don't know. And then to the right, it's the industrial production again, which is just, there you see 30% drops. And if you look at the US figures, you find that our investment fell 30% in this recession. So there's giant effects in the industry part. Services are going to be more stable, and et cetera. And then there's merchandise exports, which again is whoosh. So the global economy took a hit. The IMF has this little thing where they said, the cup spilleth over, which I think references Bible, maybe? Does anyone know? I don't know. In any case, and what they did was they estimated some models in which they said, what's been driving this? And their estimates were it's US and UK spillovers affecting the rest of the economies. And they're showing you here kind of those effects on each of the different lines tells you on different other countries or other places. And so the sort of the reading from their models or analysis is we did it and it spilled over. How? Well, obviously through the our decline of imports and as well as some financial things. This is effects on global employment. And what you'll see here, the one is global employment, the other is poverty trends. And we have the employment to population ratio, which is the key thing, going down significantly in this recession around the world. But about half of it is the advanced countries, and much less for the poorer countries, and then poverty going up. So this had an effect. The key thing to understand is, of course, you don't see so much employment effect in the developing countries, but that doesn't mean that people aren't impacted severely. What happens is they go into the informal sector. And this is some estimates earlier about how long it took people in recessions to get out of the informal sector. So you see there are 4 Latin American countries where they said 2 to 3 years, and then 2 Latin American and Indonesia where it took 5 to 6 years, and they still were not out when these studies ended. So you're talking about people pushed into the informal sector for extended periods of time, and then labor participation rates, which in these poorer countries doesn't mean they're sitting home on welfare checks, because they're not getting them. They're not getting those kind of social protections. It generally means they're in the informal sector and they're not showing up as as being engaged in normal job search. World Bank, when I was there Monday, they said, and I gave them some stuff that overlaps with what the course we've done in the course. They're very excited. They like that. And then they said, we've got these great studies that show that labor's share of income has fallen sharply in some developing countries. And I leave this blank because they didn't send me the paper that they said they would. And because I was very surprised, because if this is true, it's really remarkable, because the normal pattern in a recession is for the profits share to go down. That's been historically ad infinitum. If in this recession we are not seeing profits share go down, we're seeing much more labor share go down. That's, I think, remarkable. And they thought it was remarkable too. So I really want to see that. There's a claim when I was in Washington that someone else said to me that we're anticipating our profit share will be back up to what it was before the recession this summer, which means a profit share, that's vaguely consistent with this in some deep sense, a profit share that is back to what it was when we had 5 or 6% unemployment, when we're having 9 to 10% unemployment, is a remarkable thing about the disconnect between the employment side and normal people and the business profitability. And you can see a bit of that, I suppose, if you look at almost every stock market in the world has recovered substantially, not completely, but substantially, even while unemployment is remaining high. So I just can't give you that data because they didn't send it to me, but they made this claim, and I took it as, holy mackerel, that's really quite striking, because you'd be just so different from what we've had in almost all past recessions. The World Bank expects, talk to them about their projections, because these expectations are always based on smooth sort of trend line kind of things, with some wisdom built in, but there's never an adverse shock. Somebody doesn't, some terrorist doesn't blow up all of Dubai, which would presumably cause global panic, with some kind of a horrible bomb or something. And so they're projecting modest recoveries, the way they refer to it. And they show you by countries. The East Asia and Pacific is China, largely, obviously, and the South Asia is going to be India, largely, and you see them with much faster growth rates. And you do see the countries with really sharp drops in 2009. That's the E footnote to that just says, well, of course, all the data's not in on that, and they did something to estimate what they did. This is one of the some part didn't print so well. It's too bad. But there's 2 papers that just come out, that one of which I knew about and I talked about there, which is Reinhardt and Rogoff, who've been analyzing the things. They just have a new paper which it reminds us or tells us. I'm not sure the numbers are exactly right, but they say, roughly speaking, if we keep our debt keeps going up as part of the recovery part of this. The history tells us that when debt gets above, they said 90%, you lose a point of growth. A loss of 1 percentage point of growth accumulates to trillions. It's huge amounts because it's ad infinitum, et cetera. Then they said for the emerging economies who have denoted their debt in US dollars primarily, when it reaches 60%, they suffer. So, and when I don't want to endorse these numbers or the specifics, but the message is, when we recover, that is, we're not going to recover to the same path we were on before. This is like a permanent hit on the world economy. Then I got into an argument with somebody in Washington, and he did send me the paper that he was referring to, which I didn't know about. He kept saying, this is going to be devastating to young children. And I said, well, what, young children? He says, yeah, the parents are going to be home, and they're going to, and I said, well, if the parents are home unemployed, the parents will, make sure they do their schoolwork or something. He said, nope, they're going to be stressed out, they're going to be yelling at the kids. So then he sent me a paper, and it just came out. It's an NBR paper. It's not a working paper yet. And unfortunately, the copying it over, it didn't print. But this is the husband's job losses. So if I lose my job, it has a significant net effect, a negative effect on infant health, a drop of birth weights. As kids get birth weights goes down, that's pretty bad for their lifetime future. And I said, holy mackerel. This is obviously not based on children being born now. It's based on previous, recessions. But now you're having more mass unemployment. This is what he showed. I thought it's pretty remarkable just to keep in mind how long term this recession will live. If it's going to impact and harm many children around the world because they're not going to get the same nutrition and so on, that's just stunning. So this is a thing of the effect of the parent losing their job on the probability that the kid has a birth weight less than normal. Normal is 120. I suppose that must be ounces. I was going to say it's pounds. It can't be pounds. It could be ounces. 120 ounces. And what you see is, okay, then you go, what's the problem? No noticeable kind of impacts. What it's doing is it's shifting some of this distribution down below 120, and below 80 is considered, or where that line is, 80, whatever it is, 80 something or other, is considered really bad. And this is in the U.S. Now, if you imagine that in the U.S. the loss of the job, and then it shows up in family income, and it shows up in food expenditures. Now, we have soup kitchens. We have a lot of free food in the country. We have the food stamps and so on. So even with all those things, people, when they lose their jobs, they start skimping on food. That means now the baby's not born yet, so that means it's the mother. And so that also just says, just the way Rogoff's thing said, the debt thing is going to make it harder to grow in the future. This says the kind of people we're going to have in the world are going to be more of them will have a problem if you have low birth rate. I was just stunned by this. I said, this got to me this morning. One thing did arrive, one didn't. Now I just want to talk about the 4 parts of globalization that link everything together. This is global trade. You see the red line. It's an index number that they produced. And you see it drops as we're going into our recession. Let's see, the 25, 26, 27, 28, 29 is the last year. And then on the right side, I just put down what the actual statistics were. World trade has been growing much faster than world GDP for the last 20, 30 years, I'd say. And suddenly we had world trade declining more than world GDP. And then 2010 and 2011 are obviously their projections. So the world trade is clearly more volatile than is the GDP things, which could make one suspicious of the global, of being excessively tied to the global economy. But it turns out some of those countries have been making a good recovery too. So, and this is also looking at the major countries. What was the effect in exports? This is from basically before any recovery started. So this ends in February 2009. You see China, 41% drop in exports. That would be from when the recession started, which basically is February. So it's basically a year change. So, massive. Taiwan, Japan, France, Canada. Canada sells a lot to the US. Germany. So exports were just shrinking like crazy in the first year of this recession. That's the extreme volatility of trade compared to GDP. Nobody had GDP declines of this magnitude. The big shock to me was how quickly China recovered and Korea recovered. Korea's only 10%, or I can't read it from here, where it's 10 or 16%, but whatever the Korean number is, it's less than the China, this decline. And that was when you saw 20 million peasants were sent home from the south to go back to their villages because Americans weren't buying goods in large part. So world trade is very volatile in this, but it'll also pick up volatility. China had a stimulus program, which is probably the most successful in the world. And so I spent some time talking to the World Bank guys about why this is and what they thought about this, and how come China was behaving so rationally. And so one of the people said to me, it's almost as if they're Scandinavians, who also tend to be very rational when they're thinking about policy things and reactions. And but in Scandinavia, you have different parties, but the parties don't really. A rational argument carries a lot of weight. So what they have been doing is they have been driving the world economy in large extent. And so it's certainly Asia and Japan have really benefited from this huge growth in China. China stimulated its domestic economy. This meant Chinese are buying imports. And I've been very suspicious when you see the Americans complaining, I mean, the Chinese currency maybe should be revalued, but we're the guys running the huge deficit with China. China is buying more things from Korea than they sell. China is buying, I think, more things from Japan as well than they sell. And so when we think about the difficulty of what's going on in the U.S. and China, which hopefully they'll resolve, this is a lot of an American problem. It's not, it's not that China somehow or there's a weird guy out there, and their growth has been very good in this period. And then to get back to the Rogoff-Reinhardt point, all of these countries have greatly increased their government deficits, which is going to add to their debts, which means potentially they will have slower growth in the future. I say potentially. And let me be clear about this, because it's not that they shouldn't have done the deficit thing to get out of a potential Great Depression. Obviously you had to do that, but it's kind of a choice. Whatever you were going to do, you're going to suffer a cost. And presumably the decision to go to the deficits was a smaller cost, but it doesn't mean you're going to get back to normal. That's the key lesson. You got to pay off these deficits eventually. This is the part of this. So that was trade. Now I want to just talk about the capital flows issue that links everybody together. Capital flows to developing economies have been really rising. These are private money. This obsolesces the World Bank and the IMF to a certain extent. They used to be the big loaners. Now their loans are less important. And then I showed you portfolio equity to the right. Look at the drop. Incredibly unsafe. You see it drop there in the 90s as well. The share of GDP is probably the best thing to look at, the blue line. And then you get foreign direct investments through 2008. It's just starting to go down, and that has come down. So again, the global economy in some sense multiplies. It may multiply good things, but it multiplies a shock also. That's true in these figures. Then we think of partly what's happened in this whole crisis is the banks leveraged up. And that you can see that in the global statistics. Global banking assets divided by GDP, relative to GDP. Global banking assets grew much more rapidly than GDP, and that is largely a leveraging phenomenon. So all around the world, the banks were doing some of this. And then to the right is just another one of these things, just saying these external debts from private sources went zooming down in the recession. And in some sense, that's what caused the Asian crisis in 1997. It was, people just, private debts, people just suddenly panicking and pulling their money out of these Korean banks and so on. Okay, so I'm not expecting you to read this, but you can pull the thing. One of the big issues, and when Roberto and I taught this course on globalization 5, 6 years ago, they were still arguing that capital account liberalization was a good thing. The evidence was already turning against them, that this was not. And so now this is the IMF actually citing the things in the course, the published versions of what had been working papers by their own researchers that were saying, hey, we can't really be telling the world that capital account liberalization is good. And now you see them having done a change and understanding, this is the whole point of this is, that gee, there may be a good point to have capital controls, which 7 years ago, 6, 7 years, that was considered, I don't know, you shouldn't say that. You weren't. That was not part of the dogma. And so they're citing the same. I mean, the research was there when they were still peddling the stuff, but now they've been forced, I think, to sort of to recognize this. I want to do two other parts of this, and then is immigration, which often gets left out of this. The 2010 numbers are bogus, as I point out. They're just projected. We have 195 million people as of 2005 who were immigrants. That was a real number. And it's been growing. So a lot of immigration. What does this recession do to immigrants? People who are moving to a better country, not a better country, a different country to improve their lives. We take the Mexicans to the US, we have pretty good statistics. The estimated Mexican-born population basically flattens out. The Mexicans aren't coming anymore. The migrants from central and southern Mexico, this is now Mexican data as opposed to the other was US data, shows a big drop in people coming to the US. This doesn't count, this is of people headed towards the US. It isn't measuring Mexicans going back home, which could easily be as big or bigger. And then all these illegal immigrants, our estimate is they've fallen by 1 million people. So 1 million characters who were here without proper documentation turned back home. So what this has done, if you really don't like immigrants, just run a Great Depression in your country and they won't come. And a lot of people will leave too. This has occurred in other countries as well. I got some numbers for Spain. And Spain, you see the in-migrants going down and the out-migrants beginning to rise. Still some in-migration into Spain, but the magnitudes are clearly just vastly less. And then work permits in Taiwan, which is a much more controlled society. And you see they were giving lots of work permits to basically people from poor Asian countries primarily to come and work. They're still giving it for caregivers and maids, but they just, when the manufacturing went down, they just basically said, nope, we don't need any people from these various countries. So this has caused a real cutback in immigration. For the Americans, this could be quite scary because more and more of our PhDs in science and engineering in particular are foreign-born. I mean, we're living off foreign-born people. You look at, not a law school is, but you look at my department, and extraordinary number. It's not extraordinary; it's normal at this point. But one would have thought years ago, an extraordinary number of people are just foreign-born. Boom. And so you begin to say, "Oh my goodness! If this cuts into that, that's really harmful for the U.S." And so I did this little picture that I use at science things. I thought, this is what we would do in our labs if the foreign-born students and immigrants went home. Labs would close over this country. Half the labs in the U.S., the science labs, would be done. So this part of the globalization is very, very important to this country. And if immigration were to drop, we'd be problems. Who, it turns out, are the main source of our educated immigrants? There are a lot of students here, I'm sure, who are foreign-born. I'll just guess that to be the case. Well, you are it. The proportion of the foreign-born who get their highest degree in the US at bachelor's, master's, and doctorate level is the number 64%, 69%, 54%. Meaning the US gets these foreign-born people. You come as an international student, and the country keeps you. So I put the implication being, if you want to attract highly educated immigrants, you attract international students. International students are likely to stay in your country, and that's a critical thing. So thus far, a Great Depression might have ended this completely, but we've avoided that, and that's not so bad. The last thing about the globalization international economy that I think is extraordinarily important is that everybody else in the world, almost every country, North Korea hasn't, I think, has been building up their university systems extraordinarily rapidly. And so these are some figures through 2006. And what you see is big drop in the American share of higher education enrollments from 29% in 1970 to 12% today. America is clearly, the other advanced countries have vaguely maintained their share. The big thing has been the developing countries. So there's a mass higher education program going on in China is extraordinary. I'll say a little more about that in a second. And that means the whole, as we make this recovery, we're recovering into a world in which this country and the other advanced countries no longer have this incredible dominance that we had in the 70s and 80s in higher education, where we were the place and we were the things. And this just goes to China data, which is 6 million guys graduated in 2008, bachelor's degrees. 6 million. You start thinking, if you're from Switzerland, you might say, oh, my God, that's more people than I have in my whole country. If you're from Ireland, you're saying, wow, it's extraordinary. And I didn't get updates from the engineering. China is now second in the world in R&D spending to the United States. And so this crisis, beneath the crisis, there's a huge global change that the world should be adjusting to. It would be much better, obviously, we adjusted to it in a full employment kind of setting. These are international students just growing. I could not find data through the recession. And this is a remarkable thing about the globalization and the way the world has become when we think about this. This is in the great Chinese city of Peoria, Illinois. We have an American company, Caterpillar, coming to recruit Chinese students from basically the University of Illinois. And you just look at this, you say, that's amazing. So the students are coming here, they get educated here, and an American firm wants them to go back to China to be running their Chinese or working as engineers or whatever it is in their Chinese operation. So it's the intertwining of the world that this is a recession that sort of it affects every country in multiple ways when you start thinking about this. And I wondered, I said, it says target students and scholars from China. Probably if I went, and I'm not a student or a scholar from China, they probably would allow me in because it would be discrimination against our law to do something. But and I just wonder how many non-Chinese students actually showed up to this saying, well, yeah, I want to work in China. Eventually, you'd expect a lot of people from elsewhere to do. And then the last comment is just, and this came very striking in this discussion at the World Bank, but first I just give you some OECD. All of these international organizations they know that everything they've been selling is wrong. They don't often admit how wrong it is. The OECD, I think we discussed a little bit of this earlier, they're just basically telling us everything about flexible labor markets that they told us has not worked in this recession. That's what they said. And I like to always quote these guys because it's easier to hear from them than for you to be a critic outside and you say, hey, look, you got no evidence for this. Why are you saying this? Maybe it's true. I always used to say, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But gee, don't you have a responsibility to give real evidence before you try out some policies on people? And now they say, well, they tried the policies. Now they know the policies don't work. The IMF leader this French guy, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, had a meeting at what was called the Bretton Woods Committee. And this is to show the way these organizations are thinking. So he says, we meet to discuss, of course, the future role of the fund. The fund has got to find a place for itself in this world. And the same thing is true of the World Bank and other groups. And so he talks about doing something different. When you actually look at the details, it's less clear how much different they want to do things, but greater surveillance, faster lending, and to do something, this is the one that's tricky, I think, strengthening the long-term stability of the international monetary system. He's not saying to get rid of the US dollar as the sort of currency of, but he sort of discusses that a bit. You know, it's kind of like, and the question of what you do is so these organizations are really and the World Bank was very clear to me. You know, they're sitting there saying, everything we've been doing on poverty and all this, a lot of it just got destroyed. What do we do? How do we operate? Et cetera, et cetera. The Dominique Strauss-Kahn is I think he's a French socialist, or he's a French. And so he has a sort of Europeanish perspective. The head of the World Bank is Mr. Wolf. Is it Wolfowitz? Is the head now?
Zellick.
Wolfowitz was replaced. That's correct. Right. Zellick. Yeah, but he's a Bush appointee. And so I talk to people. I say, well, how's he responding to all this? Well, he's reading all these memos saying everything we were doing doesn't look so good, and he hasn't spoken out this much, but he seems to be also moved. This is I've forgotten now, this is World Bank or IMF. So I think it's a World Bank study, but I could be wrong. It could be an IMF study. And what I just want to put stress, it almost doesn't matter what the coefficients are, what the regressions are. It's the key variable that they talk about is institutional quality, and which is created by an index. One of whom, Kaufman, was a former student of mine at Harvard, so I have a good feeling towards him. Cray is a guy I don't trust at all at the World Bank. But they created this index. And what they're now saying is, it's this institutional quality index that really matters in some of the variables that we think are important. Here it's a question of private sector credit. So how much is the private sector providing credit to companies? And then it's, are you attracting capital inflows? And that's what they put the stress on. There's obviously different things with some of the other ones. I just want to ignore them. But the key thing is they suddenly are talking about institutional stuff and changing the institutions. And then the last thing is, I conclude, there really is a readiness in these international organizations. The governments may not be ready, and the governments may have different views, and nothing may come of this, but they are sitting around looking and saying, how do we reinvent ourselves? How do we become relevant and cogent? And I gave them a message from our course. I said, if the World Bank starts speaking more sharply about changing things in a big way, that has some influence on the world community. People always could cite you as saying, oh, we should go through the liberalization of the finance sector, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. And since you no longer believe that, you should be out there pretty, and pushing your leaders to think more broadly. And then I showed the great invention of the wheel, where the guy turned it over and got himself a store. And that's good creative thinking. And the question is, can you turn one of these institutions over where it's risky rolling down the hill and they got little rocks there to keep it. But hey, you just turn it over and it suddenly becomes that it's no longer risky. And I'm thinking of parts of the banking sector. That's my sort of introduction to the discussion.
So the topic is globalization. And I propose to speak on two specific topics under this large aegis. The first topic is, why have the BRIC countries done, on the whole, relatively better in the crisis? And what are the lessons to derive from this relative success that they have had? And the second larger topic is, how should we begin to think about the relation between the crisis and the world economic order? In what respect does the structure of the present order help explain the dynamic of the crisis? And in what way does the crisis present an opportunity for the transformation of the order? So first, the BRIC countries. I begin with a simple factual observation. With one exception, Russia, the BRIC countries have done much better than the rich developed economies in the crisis. Russia has been significantly affected, as you know, by the fall in the price of oil and gas, but above all, by its underlying failure to develop a strategy of economic growth that would make it less dependent on the extraction of natural resources. So the question presented is, does the relative success of at least 3 of the 4 BRIC countries, China, India, and Brazil, suggest a direction for the world as a whole? My fundamental answer to this question is no, it does not. They have succeeded relatively through a series of second bests that do not present a path for the world. So the first second best is the precautionary accumulation of massive reserves, which have made them much less vulnerable than they would otherwise be to instability in the world economy. This protection, however, has been acquired at enormous cost. The reserves represent a relatively sterile, although vast, mass of capital. There has been an attempt to explore ways in which they could be put to productive use through, for example, the creation of sovereign funds. But all such efforts are in their infancy, and it is not clear whether they will progress. On the other hand, the opportunity cost for the acquisition and maintenance of these reserves is immense, given the differentials in the cost of money around the world. The second explanation for why the BRIC countries have been relatively more successful in the crisis is that they have avoided penetration by international finance, at least to the degree that was recommended by the pre-existing ideological consensus and by the academic, economic, and political authorities of the rich countries. So the penetration by finance, and especially by foreign finance, has been much, much less than was recommended by the high science of economics. But of course, this too is a second best, a purely negative precaution, and it is a second best to the following. It is a second best to success in the attempt to find a way to mobilize the productive potential of world capital, of risk capital, and not simply speculative portfolio investment, that could be combined with broad-based internal financial deepening in each of these countries. A way of organizing finance that would put finance at the service of a broad-based productive agenda, combining diversification of production with democratization of opportunity. The third reason why the BRIC countries have been relatively successful, and in particular why China and Brazil have been relatively successful, is that they have been able to use the public banks, or the publicly controlled banks, and the governmental agencies to force a program of sustained investment in the face of the crisis. But this too, once again, is a second best. It is a second best to a broad-based project of socially inclusive economic growth. So they have been more successful for all these reasons. But to my mind, their success does not amount to a strategy that is capable of being translated into an example for the world. It is a collection of these second bests. Now I go on to the second and major question. How does the structure of the world order explain the worldwide development of the crisis? And in what respect is the crisis an opportunity for the transformation of that order? I begin with a central thesis about the nature of the order that has been built in the world in the second half of the 20th century, in the aftermath of the Second World War. The main idea animating the construction of the world order in the second half of the 20th century is the idea of convergence under the sponsorship of the great powers, that the whole world would converge to the same set of best institutions and practices, that the goals of economic openness and of political or military security would become entangled in the project of convergence. Now, this Metternichian idea, embraced by the great powers, has been very imperfectly realized. It has been realized almost not at all with respect to the security arrangements of the world. It has been realized haltingly with respect to the monetary arrangements. And it has been realized most fully only with regard to the commercial arrangements, to the organization of the new world trade regime. And I will now say something about that differential realization of the Metternichian project. The security arrangements. The world has no security arrangement. The only security arrangement that exists in the world is the security arrangement of the United Nations system under the supervision of its Security Council. And the basic situation that exists in the world is the following: that when the United States and its allies believe themselves to be threatened in a vital security interest and conclude that they have not obtained adequate redress from the security system, they go outside it and organize a so-called coalition of the willing. The result is that the only security system that we have in the world, fragile as it is like a balloon that is sometimes filled with air and sometimes emptied of air. The great powers play with it, sometimes taking it seriously and sometimes casting it aside, with immense danger to the whole of humanity. So the Metternichian project has not been realized in the realm of security arrangements at all. Then we come to the monetary arrangements in the world. And there is a faltering realization of the security arrangements. At the time of the negotiations after the Second World War, Keynes and others proposed a system that would prevent the accumulation of large surpluses. This system was sunk by the United States, which then imposed an alternative, the original Bretton Woods system, and is now the victim of its own reluctance then. the present system of monetary arrangements would have to be questioned and transformed in three respects to prevent the emergence of the very large structural imbalances that are a major feature of the present world crisis. First, the dollar would have to go as the world reserve currency. And we know it will go. It's really only a question of time. Although the American statesmen complain bitterly against any attempt to prepare the overcoming of the reliance on the dollar as the reserve currency. And there are basically two classes of solutions in the short term to this dependence on the dollar as the reserve currency. One is to create a basket of reserve currencies, and the other is to develop a form of quasi-money, of special drawing rights, either within or outside the framework of the International Monetary Fund. The significance of this aspect of the alternative is this. A very simple way to understand part of the genesis of the crisis worldwide from the standpoint of the United States, which was and is the epicenter of the crisis, is that the United States, for a long time, has simply ceased to produce enough goods and services that the rest of the world wants. And instead of confronting the consequences of this simple fact, it has postponed or evaded the consequences by living off borrowed money in many different ways. Through an internal pseudo-democratization of credit, and through this dependence on the foreign funding of its public debt, facilitated by the special role of the dollar as the world reserve currency. Now, the second aspect of the monetary system that would have to be questioned and transformed. There would have to be some arrangement to do now what Keynes wanted then. That is to say, some arrangement that would contain or punish the mercantilism of some of the great countries in the world, such as China, the uncontrolled accumulation of vast surpluses. But in the spirit of rebellion against the Metternichian project of convergence, and in respect to the interest of humanity in promoting experimental divergence, the arrangement should not be a heavy-handed bureaucratic arrangement of the kind that Keynes favored, giving power to an international bureaucracy that could decide what was good or what was bad. It should be very simple. I'll give you an example of what a simple arrangement could be. You could say that a series of relative and absolute criteria would be used. The relative criteria regarding the ratios, the proportions of surpluses and deficits to national exports and GDP, and the absolute criteria having to do with aggregate impact on the world economy. And that once the threshold specified by these absolute and relative criteria were reached, a country would be required to float its currency. In other words, we should seek an arrangement that would be as automatic as possible and give as less discretionary power as possible to an international bureaucracy that would be guided in its decisions by a preference for some institutional trajectories over others. These two aspects of the monetary alternative, however, are entirely subsidiary to the fundamental issue, The fundamental issue is success or failure in the attempt to organize socially inclusive economic growth in the world, in the major world economies. The present system is a system that allows these countries to avoid that commitment. So in the surplus countries, beginning with China, export-oriented growth has become an escape valve, a way not to confront the internal problems and the internal opportunities. And the same has happened in reverse in the United States, that the dependence on this pseudo-democratization of credit internally and on foreign borrowing externally has become a way not to press the project of reorganizing the relation between finance and production within the country and of establishing an institutionalized broadening of economic and educational opportunity. Without advance in that project, the initial problem that I mentioned, the problem that the country does not produce enough that the rest of the world wants, cannot be solved. Now, clearly, this is an endeavor that transcends any merely monetary question. In the United States, it would hit up against the limits of the two traditions of reform that predominate in the history of the country. The tradition of defending the small against the big, and the tradition of accepting the big, but regulating it by the powers of strong national government. Neither of these two traditions would suffice. It would be necessary to begin reorganizing the market economy in its institutional form. And in China, it would require a confrontation with the alliance of political despotism and commercial greed on which power now rests. And a fundamental reorganization of power, advantage, and opportunity that demands both an intellectual and a political revolution. Now I come to the last domain, which is the organization of world trade. It has a less direct relation to the crisis, but nevertheless a powerful one. It is the domain in which what I call the Metternichian idea has been most fully realized. And its main relation to the problems that we have been discussing is that the logic under which the world trade regime has been organized over the last few decades is a logic of suppression of the institutional alternatives on which the construction of socially inclusive growth depends. Now I develop my argument as follows. You could say that the world trade regime, as organized under the WTO treaties, is being shaped by four main ideas. Each of these ideas should be challenged and replaced gradually, piece by piece and part by part, step by step. The first idea is that the goal is the maximum of free trade. But free trade is not an end. Free trade is a means. The alternative idea would be that the goal is the maximum coexistence of alternative trajectories of development within a world economy that becomes gradually more open. The second idea, and the one that bears the closest relation to these debates that we are having, is that the world trade regime is being organized under a principle of institutional maximalism. That is to say, under the principle of attempting to impose on the trading countries, in the name of world trade, adherence not only to the market economy, but also to a particular version of the market economy. And I give two examples. First, there is the attempt to outlaw under the label subsidies all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms that the countries now rich use to become rich. And second, there is the attempt to incorporate into the rules of free trade the present regime of intellectual property, the patent regime, which is a relatively recent invention of the late 19th century and has no necessary relation to the project of a market economy. Now, that this institutional maximalism is not necessary is shown by the fact that the pre-existing regime, the GATT regime, was characterized by the opposite commitment of institutional minimalism, the maximum of economic openness with the minimum of imposition of restrictive rules. It is not an economic necessity, it is an ideological choice. The third principle under which the world trade regime is being organized is the selective approach to economic freedom. The basic idea is that things and capital should be free to roam the world, but people should be imprisoned within the nation state, or in blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states such as the European Union. Now, of course, nothing would be more subversive in the world. Nothing has greater power to equalize advantage in the world than greater freedom to cross national frontiers and work abroad. And such a principle could not be instantaneously realized. But the question is the direction. What is the direction? If we think that freedom for people should accompany freedom for things and for money, then there are any number of gradual steps and precautionary measures and compensations that can organize progress in that direction. And the fourth principle on which the world trade regime is being organized is that the pretense that its human basis is free labor will be satisfied by any form of wage labor, regardless of how oppressive it is. And we can readily imagine an alternative, that the arrangements of world trade and of the world economy would require that free labor be really free, with limitations on oppression in work, with guarantees of freedom of association, and even with some manner of levy that would finance experiments in the long-term combination of self-employment with cooperation to overcome the predominance of free labor, of wage labor as the form of free labor. I remind you that all the classical liberal as well as socialist thinkers always regarded wage labor as a transitional stage in the evolution of humanity and as a continuation of serfdom and slavery. Now, in conclusion, how in general are we to understand the relation between the development of strong international alternatives and the development of strong national alternatives? I propose the following basic predominant sequence. It is unlikely that such alternatives could ever come into existence unless there is pressure from below in the form of a strong attempt to develop strong national projects. Projects directed to institutional experimentation in the service of socially inclusive economic growth. And then these attempts would press against the limits of the present world order, of the present monetary and trade arrangements. There would be a revision of these arrangements, and the revision of these arrangements would in turn make the further advance of the strong national projects possible. In this, as in everything else, the crisis presents an immense transformative opportunity. Did we not risk squandering the transformative opportunity because of the failure of the transformative imagination?
I'll make some comments or responses. Because I think the success, you referred to them as second best of the BRIC countries. This is a world in which second best is a lot better than failure. And so they actually, I would think they may have overdone the reserves. That's very, very, very possible. But that was in response to what they saw happened in the 97 Asian crisis, and they have maintained themselves. The country I know the best, I think, does pose a really tremendous challenge to us. And I don't know too much about India or Brazil. It's China. And China is not a democracy. One of the reasons the Chinese banks, as you said, they told them, send the money out, and they did. It may still blow up some of it because some of that money may not have been spent, and it's not out of the question they'll have a banking crisis, sometime in the future. But part of this is because in every Chinese company, there is one high-ranking official who is a member of the party, and it may be the head of the company, including a private company, and whose loyalties thus far have been more towards what the party tells that person. And the party, for reasons I don't understand because I don't know too much about how that party has been making these decisions, economic decisions, that are better than most countries in the world. When we think of a single party state, China, of course, went through the Mao thing. We think of how disastrous a single dictatorial group could be. Maybe because the Chinese got so burnt by that they have limited the power of any of the individual leaders, so at least they don't have a danger of insane dictator of some form. But even having said that, the party now has lots of millionaires. They have in their consulting group to one of these committees. It has extremely wealthy folks from China on this. It would seem natural that party would have been taken over by the new emerging billionaires. China's income inequality is the same as the U.S. at this point, or was last time I looked, just a few years ago. And I think that there is a real challenge there that troubles me. That are we seeing where a dictatorial or a single party state, maybe dictatorial should be a little more modified, but that has no intentions of going toward in the near term future certainly towards a democratic contested thing, that is horrified by the American government because that our government has become dysfunctional in some level. The two parties cannot agree on anything. That there's a possibility that this kind of a regime is better suited for the making economic decisions. I think that's a huge challenge put by the success of China. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in different countries sitting saying, well, it's not an evil regime in the way that the Russian communists were. It's not an evil regime if you think of the Latin American context, it's not the Peronistas making crazy, decisions in the economy. It's a regime that so far has behaved extremely rationally, maybe overly cautious on the reserves and so on, but has done an extremely good job. And I don't know that here, either in economics or political science, we have any great models of why a regime would be behaving so well in these crises. And it is a regime with this extraordinary corruption all over the place. So it's like they know a certain amount of corruption, that's allowable, but you still, in the end, make decisions that seem to be in the interests of the country. So I'm more impressed with that's the only one I really know with some depth. And I don't fully understand, why they should be doing a better job at making the decisions and dealing with the reforms. I mean, that'd be my first comment. The other thing that I would, or two other comments. The convergence story, there's an element that we have converged, and that is the communist ideology of non-market state planning disappeared. And a lot of the earlier post-war period was driven by that as an alternative to markets. And so in that sense, everybody has converged in some form to a market. Then, I agree 100%, even within the Western countries, the Scandinavians are very different than the Americans. The Canadians were our closest characters in many things. Still, they do lots of things that are quite different than we do, starting with their national health care plan, which is it's a huge difference in that. And the Japanese have different ways of doing things, and the Koreans have different ways of doing things. So I think, in that sense, I think we have had divergence, and the pressures to cause the convergence haven't really worked. When the Americans, after winning World War II, this is something I know in some detail, we tried to impose U.S. labor relations practices onto Germany and Japan. And that meant National Labor Relations Board, votes for union leaders, the whole U.S. spectrum of New Deal legislation. Of the Japanese, you can see some remnants in the Japanese law in this. And in fact, both Japan and Germany, and Italy I don't know that much about, but they all went back to their own style of unionism and labor practices, and we failed. I mean, there was a very explicit effort. We said, do it our way. It didn't work, and they spit it out pretty quickly. So I think the whole convergence thing, except for the communist part, has never worked, and it may have been a dream of some people that everybody should look like Wall Street, and that hasn't worked. The other part, though, I think wage labor has a lot of advantages over what we have in the world. We have 60% of the workers in the world, it's a rough estimate. I mean, I showed the numbers for self-employed. It was, forgotten, 30% or something like that worldwide, and that isn't all the informal sector. At best estimates would be about 60% of the workers in the world are informal. The recession has increased the informal. Those workers by all, except for the entrepreneurial people in those places. That if you're a young entrepreneur doing an informal startup company, and including a startup company in China, you have a lot of creativity in the things you like, and we all like. But the typical worker in those places would jump at a chance to work in a wage job. The safety conditions, I know in Korea, are so much worse. And it is extremely hard to have safety conditions in a small company that doesn't have a lot of regulatory other things. So I think the goal of the World Bank and other people has always been more wage and salary labor. But they were looking at saying the alternative can be pretty bad on average. I think they are wrong in that thing. I don't think they're ever going to really reduce the informal sector. And so it's an issue of taking the informal sector and building institutions to strengthen it. But that's going to make it look more like the formal wage and salary sector, which I think most workers in every country in the world would rather be in, because you have a lot of benefits and things. You lose something, but you have a lot of benefits, as well. So those are my main.
Depending on what it is, right? I mean, it's not just the semblance of a contractual relation that suffices. It has to have some reality to it.
No.
Because the contractual schema can be a disguise of what is in fact a situation of almost unlimited oppression.
Well, correct. And if you think of one example of this, where the Chinese government's made an effort, I don't think very successful, the new labor law was meant to give a migrant worker a contract that could be legally enforced with the guarantees. The problem with the migrant workers is sometimes they're not paid at all. And they can't go to, where do they go? To court. They don't have a paper, a document. I'm the boss. I say, I didn't tell Charlie I was going to pay him anything. There's a minimum wage. He didn't work that many hours. When these guys are sleeping on the place and working all the time, of course. So they have made some effort. We've gone the other way. What we have done is there's a big growth in I know it's the U.S. I'm not sure the other countries. Independent contractors. That's a way that I'm not responsible for your health care. I'm not responsible for your unemployment insurance, because you're an independent contractor. And therefore, and we know in our faculties, tenure faculty are not covered by this. Faculty, but we have short-term faculty, and it's grown massively. People who are basically independent contractors with
So there are three interlocking phenomena, right? There's the existence in the world of a huge number of workers who are in the so-called informal economy, working without any legal protection.
That's right.
Right? Then second, within the formal economy, there's the phenomenon of precarious labor, subcontracted temporary labor, as a way of avoiding the protections of the labor laws.
Right.
And then third, there's the use of the formal wage structure as a disguise to conceal oppression. All those things coexist. So actually my comments about wage labor were meant to address all three. Now, I simply want to make more explicit than it perhaps was a premise of my remarks. The premise is that these attempts to reorganize the relation between finance and production and to institutionalize a broadening of economic and educational opportunity depend on institutional experiments. And therefore, we all in the world have an interest in a form of monetary and commercial organization that favors such experiments rather than suppressing them. That's a basic theme. And then there's this additional consideration. If we develop a system in which the goals of economic openness and of political security are entangled in the acceptance of a particular system of institutional convergence, then all of those who rebel against the system of convergence will also end up rebelling against the goals of economic openness and of political security. That's the problem. And that's why it is such a dangerous project, this Metternichian project, on which the great powers have embarked over the last several decades.
Without much success.
Let's hope.
So, who wishes to speak first? Yeah.
I was curious if you could say anything more about, I found that really interesting, the idea that China has been making economically rational decisions. So I've heard conflicting signals also. Like, for example, taking a course here as a 1L, and the professor cited some statistics, may not be legitimate, but that if you factored in all the environmental
Yeah, I would have said that China was making, when we say rational, we're always talking about second best, things. It's you can always find some things that they're doing, which are nutty, and some things that are morally offensive, and so on. The growth of the university sector. When Mao destroyed, there were no university students, basically. People were marching through we would have dunce caps on our head and be sent to I don't know, to pick potatoes in Maine or something. And I know some people who went through that, or knew some. They're probably dead by now. And they built up a higher education system with some extraordinary decisions. I'll tell you one that I just keeps. No country in the history of the world has sent its best and brightest students to outside the country to be educated, and not really been troubled when many of them decide not to come back. And not only that, China has given scholarships for people to come, and they know that many of them are not going to come back. It's an extraordinary far-sighted vision. I think that's a correct vision. Meanwhile, they've built up an education system very fast. There's a lot of criticism you can make of their 6 million university graduates, bachelor's graduates. Because when you build up a system over it's almost 10, it's slightly over 10 years, from doubled it basically. Obviously, you're going to build in a lot of poor quality. Korea did something similar, just as a footnote earlier. On the other hand, you build it up, and now you've got to start getting the quality ups. And you see that's a far-reaching decision as well. China, when I said, was the second biggest R&D center in the world. Yeah, we don't have good deflators for this, and that's the OECD so reported, and I quoted them. But I wouldn't, I don't want to be, as you said, the environmental things that this other professor cited. But they've made a huge investment in R&D. And on the environment side, yes, they've done a lot of pollution. The water quality in places is really bad. And they are now it's bothering the Americans. They are producing the wind turbines. They have they're making a huge investment in solar stuff. And you might have said, gee, they should have moved earlier to deal with the environmental things. And probably true. But they are moving to deal with that. And they're not sitting around fighting, whether or not there is climate change, or there's a whole set of things that we seem to get boggled down in. It still may be. It's still a corrupt party. There's a lot of corruption in the society. I think a little bit. Let me maybe make something that's. I don't mean to. I'm for democracy, so let me say it carefully. I think in some cases a dictatorship, in this particular dictatorship at least, they are so worried about that they are not fully legitimate, that the second things go bad, people will blame them. They're deeply concerned about inequalities. They do not want to see, 100 million peasants get really frazzled and start going through the streets. So that's part of, I think, their control of the internet. There was an interesting debate, because I'm not in favor of their internet interventions. Somebody said, well, you can still get English sites. It's just meant so the average Chinese doesn't see things. Whereas if you're going to you can get things through English, because they know that that's just the educated elite would be able to read that and so on. I may be rational. I don't think it's a very not a good policy, and I think in the long run they're going to have to back away from controlling the flow of information. How could you send your young people, your future leaders, and it's your kids if you're a party leader? There's nobody I know in China. I know a bunch of characters who's in the upper either income bracket or in the party, whose kids are not being educated in the U.S., and many of them being educated starting at the level of high schools. I mean, private schools, of course. So then you could see, well, the long term, it can't possibly be that you anticipate you're going to have the same, controls over things that you have. So I think in general, you'd say this has been a very successful, what Roberto might call a heterodox alternative growth strategy to what we would have said, and it's worked. And you just wonder how they keep control over the bad things that could have developed and that many people. Let me just say this, because on this institution indicator, the institution indicator is based on transparency, its lack of corruption, all the things we would regard as good. China is bad on most of those. So when they code up China, they code it up as it's not the worst in the world, but it's pretty bad. My guess is Russia's worse. I haven't looked at the indicator of late. India is probably pretty bad, and I would guess Brazil maybe is a bit better, but none of the 4 countries that have done so well in this thing fit that well on that indicator. There'll be some African countries in particular that will be worse and have performed worse. So I don't want to claim we don't have examples of guys doing very badly on these bank indicators. But that China has succeeded by not following those set of institutional rules is quite interesting.
So I found the talk really inspirational, and there's all this language of transformation, fundamental reorganization, revolution of thought. Any sort of revolution would have to happen within some political backdrop, some big idea.
Yes.
So here's my question: is the big idea that sounds really cool, and the big idea that seems to be out there is we need a system that's open, democratic. There's some sort of link between progress and good and democracy of some sort. That's what I got. And so my question is, if I look to the 19th century, the idea of convergence, of getting together and working this out, of co-development, was always an imperial project. That even if we were talking about like individual freedom or something, was always operating in a bigger structure or system of logic. And so my question is the big idea something that's working within the framework we have right now? Or is the critique that the framework we have right now is just analytically not up to the task as well as empirically not?
Yes.
And are we trying to find something beyond that? Is that
Well, you're asking me. So first, of course, there's here an expository problem, because the topic of this course is the crisis, but then it touches on the issue of the alternatives for contemporary societies, for humanities. And we have not had a discussion about alternatives as such. The debate about alternatives has come in tangentially. But one of the premises of my interventions in the course is that the crisis reveals the limitations of the present institutional and intellectual structure in these societies, and at the same time signals the importance of the creation of alternatives. So let's consider the example of the United States. So we have a particular world to address and some very simple ideas. So first idea, a basic aspect of the genesis of the crisis in the United States is Americans don't produce enough stuff that the rest of the world wants. And then they postpone the day of reckoning through all this borrowing and pseudo-democratizing of credit. Second idea, more fundamental than that idea. The basic tragedy of the country, the paradox of American life, as of other contemporary societies, as of my country, Brazil, is that the United States seethes with vitality, with creative and constructive energy, and much of it goes to waste because the mass of ordinary people don't have the necessary economic and educational equipment to put all of this dynamism to constructive use. And that's the basic reason why the United States doesn't produce enough of the stuff that the rest of the world wants. So it would be necessary to organize a project in the United States, as in some of these other major contemporary societies, of socially inclusive economic growth. Now then comes a third idea. It can't be done within the limitations of the dominant traditions of reform in the United States and elsewhere. It's not just about regulating the market. It's about reorganizing the market in its institutional content. That doesn't fit within the tradition of defending the little against the big, and it doesn't fit within the tradition of regulating the big. It's something else. And it goes beyond the limits of these traditions of American reform. Now comes the fourth idea. The deck of intellectual cards, the structure of the high culture, is stacked against us because it doesn't provide the intellectual equipment that we need to address this problem. It severs rather than deepens the link between insight into the actual and the imagination of the possible. The positive social sciences like economics tend to explain the established arrangements by their functional superiority, their naturalness, their necessity. The normative disciplines like political philosophy and legal theory put a kind of humanizing halo on the established arrangements and provide a metaphysical prop to the practices of compensatory redistribution. And the humanities are engaged in a narcissistic escapism, disconnected from the reorganization of society. So the high culture is part of the problem and not part of the solution. So that's an answer to your question. Huh? But the crisis is the knock on the door of history. It wakes us up, and then we seek a greater life.
Who wishes to speak next? We are paid, so we could end the class early. That's not a problem for us. We're not on an hourly basis, and so if there is no other things, can we break? There's no objection?
Well, I'm resigned to that. It seems to me. I think I have a question, which is, is there some line of inquiry into the crisis, some way of looking at it in its reality, in its transformative significance, that we could have pursued or should pursue next time? This is a particular take, and you're all participating in this since the beginning. We wonder what you think. Is there some other approach?
I wrote down something very similar. I just said, what are the alternatives one could think of? That people would think about if you were to reorganize parts. Now, some of that, it's very hard to think abstractly about a giant system. So you can even think about reorganizing something about the university, something about a company you worked at that you could see things about. Let me just make a comment on that. It's like I had a dinner with some of the freshmen in the freshman dining hall, and there seemed to be a certain organizational inefficiency at the end. People were standing with their trays lined up, and apparently this happens quite often. And it apparently happens, I was told, at lunchtime in a terrible way. The people are just, it's a big, and I said, gee, couldn't somebody organize a better system for this? And of course, this gets to see what Roberto thinks of this. And the student said, yeah, we might, but we're not going to be freshmen in a little bit of a while, so who cares? And we've all done some adjustments to this inefficiency. And because I think if one thinks about alternative ways of structuring something, one knows very closely and up front, that then can lead to thinking more broadly about how do you just restructure something else. You think about the freshmen. I've been thinking about that since this thing, because I now ask seniors and juniors. And I said to them, did you have this experience? And they say, yes, it's a very inefficient freshman dining hall system. And then I said, well, students in my other class, I said, how's about somebody write a paper how to organize it? No, I'm planning to go work for some of the investment houses. I want to do a paper that'll help me on my career as I go out the door, not backwards reforms, to the freshmen. And then you can say, as American workers have famously said, when they didn't want to do any work sharing, it was, I suffered when I was a young person by the seniority system. I want to see today's young people, suffer. I want to have the benefits of what may be an inefficient, layoff system, because that's only right in some sense. So I like this notion, and then if people could maybe come in, I think, thinking about if there was one thing in the organizational structure, you could do the whole world, but it might be easier to think about things you deal with. And we had a discussion of that. Maybe that would lead into this thinking of what Roberto pointed out has been the missing element. What are the alternatives that one can think about? How do you get thinking about that path, to where you begin saying, okay, if we can redo, I don't know, the freshman dining facilities, then maybe you think about, maybe we can redo some other things in the society.
So I'll make two remarks. First, going back to the very first class here in the course, and thinking of the whole subsequent development of the argument, it seems to me clear that there's a contrast of two basic attitudes to the crisis and to any theoretical approach to it. One attitude is the crisis is a threat. It's an interruption. Let's get over it. Let's change things to be sure that this doesn't happen again, or is less likely to happen again. And that may be the predominant attitude of both the theoreticians and the practical agents. But there's another attitude, which is the crisis is an opportunity for transformation and for understanding. The crisis reveals something that is hidden and reveals the value and the possibility of a reconstruction. And that's a completely different attitude. And it seems to me very hard to imagine that the position you take as between those two attitudes would be simply generated out of your study of the crisis. Obviously, we bring those attitudes to a study such as this. And to a modest extent, the pre-existing position that we have may be modified, deepened, or reconsidered in the light of such a study. Now, my second remark is this. In taking the second position, the position that it's not just something to get over, it's not just a threat for which we have to find the right antidote, but that it is an opportunity for insight and for transformation. There is a problem that is particularly relevant in intellectual setting. The problem is that you can't progress in project like that, unless you combine mastery of a vast range of technical detail and of factual circumstances with the development of a conception, of a vision. And this dialectic between an idea, a prophetic conception, and the penetration of a large mass of recalcitrant technical detail is a huge obstacle, because it's easy to have a vision when it's not embodied in the world. It's easy to be a realist when you accept everything, and it's easy to be a visionary when you don't confront anything. But the path in the world is to accept little and to confront much. And that is a tall order, but that's what's necessary. And it seems to me to be a task that has a spiritual as well as an intellectual demand.
And I'd say the most direct way of dealing with that problem is a decentralized federalist system where you allow a lot of experimentation, because nobody knows exactly what is going to work. The alternative to that is we don't have a good enough science to do. They're doing some of this with climatology, saying, well, if you change this, how would it change the climate thing? And those models are, they're better than any social science model I know. When you do a new airplane nowadays, you first do all kinds of computer simulations, but we don't have that technology. So I think it is very much you have to do your experimentation in the real world, which means you almost have to do it in small settings, hoping it can scale up. There is this problem. We've had a number of experiments in prisons about how to rehabilitate prisoners. And as far as I know, at one point I knew this very well. I haven't paid that much attention to recent, so I'll just say this is past knowledge, but I'm sure if I was wrong, someone would have told me. You have a prison and the thing where there's a great warden, and he does all these programs, and then the next prison over says, oh, it's the programs, puts the programs in without the right culture or the right thing, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't, and that is a problem with countries as well. You try X in this country, and it may not carry over to that country. So it has to be, I think, small experiments, and then you have to just pray that it'll scale up, or you scale up slowly.
Because a process of transformation can be gradualist and piecemeal in its method, but nevertheless radical in its outcome.
Yes.
And that's an idea that we have implicitly evoked here many times.
So just trying to spin off from that a little bit. So it seems like, what you're suggesting right now is a kind of experimental approach to economics and government policy in general. And it seems to be, in my mind at least, very opposed to what's happened in the past, especially with things like the efficient market hypothesis, which has developed from this on high kind of thing. And so in the field of economics, I mean, coming at it as a scientist, it seems to be very much, oftentimes, not as rigorous. And the consequences of that are pretty staggering. I mean, we have efficient market hypothesis percolating throughout the entire corporate world and the government world and the IMF and the World Bank and everything. And you see this touching everywhere. There's the level of rigor behind it seems really staggering to that it's not there. So I guess my question is, how did that happen? And what can we do to change the field so that we demand more and don't let it happen again?
I think it happened sort of gradually over the last 30, 40 years. It happened because I think in part it was permitted to happen by this moderation. That we didn't see great disasters. I would not be surprised, but I don't know of any study that there was some self-interest in parts of it by certain groups. You certainly can get a lot of money from some business groups if you support certain views and not others. There is though an analogy in physics, which is string theory, which also developed very beautiful mathematics and was not connected to the world. Now, the string theory didn't cause any great harm to anything in the world, as far as I can see.
Is that $1 trillion cost or something?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's sort of slowed down of its own accord, because I think the economics is going to be going through big changes. In the Harvard department, behavioral economics is very strong. And that is clearly based from the ground. I think the efficient market ideologues are in some retreat. So I think we will see a change as time goes on. It probably goes on very slowly, because if I'm a professor who's made his career doing the efficient markets, and I'm a very famous, distinguished guy for proving some theorem about efficient markets under some conditions, it's awfully hard for me to turn around and say, I was wrong. And it'll happen by young people saying, okay, that's very nice. Now let's, and the same way in the physics, it happens, young people say, no, I don't want to study string theory anymore. I want to go and I want to do the CERN, whatever it is there. Or I want to work on less fancy statistics that actually, nano, whatever it'll be, quantum qubits. I don't know enough physics to know. But there's a whole set of stuff that's clearly very practical and that we can test and the world will benefit from.
But in response to your question, here too, there's a basic contrast of attitudes. So one view is, and it's a view taken by many progressives, by many progressive economists, I suppose by most of them, which is that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the mainstream of economic analysis, that it has often been put to wrong uses because it has been abused, not rigorously applied. That is the dominant position. I should say that I disagree with that position, and I think that there is something wrong with the mainstream of economics since the late 19th century, and that what is wrong can be put under three main headings. The first heading is that since the time of the marginalist revolution, economics has followed a strategy of immunity to empirical and normative controversy that is not like the strategy in any other science, in the core of pure economic analysis, in which the factual and normative starting points are taken as stipulations supplied from the outside. So that it's like an analytic machine that runs on a fuel that's provided externally. And that's a way of being invulnerable. But the price of invulnerability is sterility. And then there are these equivocal forms that introduce the empirical or the normative by weakening the analytic purity, but without really creating an alternative scientific or theoretical practice. The second main heading of the failure of the dominant intellectual practice is never properly to have confronted the implications of the institutional indeterminacy of the market. A market economy has no single natural and necessary legal form. That simple proposition is one of the main implications of the work of legal theory for over 100 years, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. But it was never fully assimilated into the inner core of economic theory. You can organize a market economy in radically different ways. And there is no system of contract and property that is built in to the very nature of a market economy that can be inferred deductively from the abstract conception of a market. The third respect in which this mainstream of economic theory is fundamentally defective is the idea, I mentioned at an earlier moment in the course, that it's like half of Darwinism. So it's like a theory of competitive selection in which the other half, which is the genesis of the varied material, is not an object of the theory. And, but it's a kind of accident. So why are there separate states in the world, for example? Just an accident. It would be better that it was just one economy and so forth. But it doesn't make any sense because the fecundity of a mechanism of competitive selection depends on the range and richness of the material over which it operates. And therefore, we need a theory about the creation of this diversity of the material. Otherwise, the half of the truth, which is the theory of competitive selection, will have an indeterminate meaning until we know how to combine it with the other missing half.
In defense of because you were very careful. The inner core theory of economics is the equivalent of string theory, and it's about as, in my view, as useful. The most economists use that as a device to teach students because it's an easy teach, and it's in the textbooks and so on. But anybody who's practicing with any real problems, just the way most physicists are not string theorists, don't do that. It's true, it's became some holified thing that you sort of sat there and you say, oh my God, somebody just proved, they proved something in the Arrow-Debreu, blah, blah, blah. Theorem with uncertainty or God knows what. And that stuff, that inner core theory is, in my view, very empty. My pen says National Bureau of Economic Research. That's the part of our profession. It's the growing part of our profession. And that is empirical. It is based on analysis. We look around in our seminars and we say, are there any theorists here? And we don't chase them out. We actually would like occasional theorists. Maybe they would learn something. And Roberto, the other point made on the missing element of the variation of competitive selection. The whole structure of its theory concept, it's called endogenous growth stuff. But the heart of it is a study of research and development spending, investments meant to create new forms. There's all this discussion of innovativeness. You could all say, oh, it all stems back from Schumpeter's kind of thing. There is a lot of concern for where these things come from. We understand, and I think part of the learning process has been that your national R&D policy is your industrial policy and is going to help determine where the things are going to do. We put a lot of money into nanotechnology on this basis. We're putting a lot of money into biotech. Some of these have not panned out. And there's a whole branch of economics that studies those things. But it's inner core things I'm in agreement about, and maybe there's an element where people who are more empirical and more understanding, or because they studied the world, new things, you sort of enjoyed the theory. I'm sure a lot of physics guys had this. You enjoyed the string theory. There's great math was created in the string theory. And there's great math that's created, the game theory things and so on and so forth. It's not a secret that the game theory tells you. You change the rules a little bit, which are the institutions, and you get different outcomes. And it's absolutely, you worry. We have a branch of that's called implementation theory. And I was with a student yesterday who had studied that and was becoming empirical. And she said, and I said, well, did you learn anything from that we can use? And she said, no. Okay, that's string theory.
We're out of time. This here, I don't know whether you've seen this. This is a little note, one of a series of notes I wrote for Lula and for the Brazilian